My name is Arturo, and on the night my son was trying to secure his future, he decided I had no place in it. He told me, in front of strangers in the house my own hands helped pay for, that my memories were an embarrassment. That single moment felt colder and heavier than all the stones I carried in my youth. It was the moment I became a ghost. What would you do in my place? I want you to listen to my story until the end, and tell me, what would you have done? And please, let me know from which city in Mexico you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. The dinner was important. Marco, my son, had made that very clear. His boss, Señor Ramirez, was coming over with his wife. For weeks, my daughter-in-law, Susana, had been preparing. New tablecloths, fancy dishes I'd never seen before, and a constant stream of instructions for me. Arturo, please, just smile. Don't talk too much. Let Marco handle the conversation. I was a piece of furniture they couldn't hide, a relic they had to polish just enough so it wouldn't look too old. I sat at the end of the table, nursing a small glass of water, feeling the weight of their anxiety. The air was thick with false pleasantries, and the smell of the expensive tequila Marco had bought, a bottle he kept for occasions that, I now understood, did not include me. Everything was going smoothly. Marco was laughing at his boss's jokes, and Susana was the perfect hostess, refilling glasses and talking about their recent trip to San Miguel de Allende. Then, during a brief lull, my eyes drifted to a photograph on the mantelpiece. It was an old, faded picture of this very neighborhood, when it was nothing but dirt roads and mesquite trees. I remembered that day. I was there. A feeling, a memory so vivid bubbled up inside me. Without thinking, I cleared my throat softly. I remember when the first stones were laid for the church in this colonia, I began, my voice a little rough from disuse. My compadre Beto and we brought the cantera all the way from a quarry near... I never got to finish. Marco's face, which had been a mask of charm and ambition, twisted into something ugly. He didn't shout. It was worse. He leaned forward, his voice a low, sharp hiss that cut through the clinking of silverware. "Dad, that's enough," he said, his eyes burning with a mix of fury and shame. "No one is interested in your stories. You're embarrassing us." The words hung in the air, sucking all the warmth from the room. Señor Ramirez looked down at his plate, suddenly fascinated by his half-eaten steak. His wife gave a tight, uncomfortable smile. Susana, for her part, reached over and patted my hand with a condescending pity, as if I were a child who had just misbehaved. The gesture was more insulting than the words. In that silence, something inside me broke. It wasn't a loud crack, but a quiet, deep fracture. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread from my chest to my face. I looked at my son, at this man I had carried on my shoulders, for whom I had worked until my back ached and my hands were raw. I saw a stranger who was ashamed of the very calluses that had paid for his education, that had built the foundation of the life he was so proud of. I didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back from the table. The scrape of its legs on the tile floor was the only sound. I stood up, folded my napkin, and placed it beside my untouched plate. Then I turned and walked toward the hallway that led to my small room, the sound of forced, polite laughter starting up again behind me, erasing me completely. That night, in the solitude of my small room, the silence was louder than the forced laughter from the dining room. My life didn't flash before my eyes, no. It returned in slow, heavy waves, each one a memory that weighed more than the last. I was born in a dusty village in Zacatecas, a place where the sun baked the earth until it cracked and the only inheritance was a strong back. My father taught me how to work with my hands, how to read the language of stone and sand. He used to say, "Arturo, a man's worth is in what he builds, not what he says." I carried that lesson with me like a prayer, even when I left my pueblo with nothing but worn-out huaracs and a hunger for something more than just survival. I wanted to build a life. I met my Eleanor in Guadalajara, where I had found work on a construction crew. She wasn't like the other girls. She had a fire in her eyes, a laugh that could make the city noise disappear. We met at a small market. I had enough pesos for 2 tacos de barbacoa, and she was buying cilantro for her mother. I offered her one of my tacos. She refused at first, too proud, but I saw the hunger in her eyes that matched my own. We shared that meal, standing by a dusty street corner, and in that simple act we built the foundation of our life together. She never looked at my calloused hands with pity, but with respect. She understood that those hands were building our future, one brick, one stone at a time. My days were long and brutal. I became a stonemason, an albañil. The sun was my constant companion, beating down on my neck as I mixed cement, as I laid row after row of bricks that became walls, houses, schools. My skin turned to leather, and the fine white dust of the cement became a permanent part of me, settling in the lines of my face and under my fingernails. But I felt a pride that I can't explain. Every evening I'd walk through the growing city and see my work. I could point and say, I helped build that. It was a quiet satisfaction, knowing I was creating something solid, something that would last long after I was gone. It was my legacy, written in stone and mortar. Then Marco was born. Holding that tiny boy in my arms for the first time, I felt a kind of fear I had never known. It was the fear of failure, the terror that I wouldn't be able to give him a better life than the one I had. I looked at his perfect, soft hands, and I made a silent vow to my wife and to God. Those hands would never be rough like mine. They would hold pens and books, not shovels and trowels. He would go to a university. He would use his mind, a tool I was never taught how to sharpen. My son would not just build houses. He would own them. That single promise became the engine of my life, the fuel for every sacrifice that followed. To keep that promise, I worked until my body screamed. I was a stonemason by day, but at night, when other men rested, I took on repair jobs. Fixing leaky roofs, patching cracked walls, anything that would bring in a few extra pesos. I remember countless nights coming home long after midnight, the smell of dust and sweat clinging to my clothes. Eleanor would be asleep in a chair, a plate of food left for me on the table, always cold. I'd eat in silence, too tired to wake her, watching her sleep. There were years where I felt more like a ghost in my own home than a husband or a father, but every time I looked at Marco sleeping peacefully in his bed, I knew it was worth it. I was a bridge he could walk across to a better future. During those years, my compadre Beto and I started doing something that everyone else thought was foolish. We used what little money we had left over to buy land. Not good land, not farmland. We bought the rocky, useless patches on the outskirts of the city, the land that no one wanted. Arturo, you're buying dust and scorpions, people would laugh. But I saw the new roads being planned. I saw the city expanding like a slow-moving tide. Eleanor was the only one who didn't think I was crazy. We'd walk out to those plots on a Sunday, and she'd say, "This is our secret, mi amor, our little piece of tomorrow." We called our quiet venture EA Properties, Eleanor and Arturo. It was our private dream. Marco's schooling was everything. Every peso we saved went to his books, his uniforms, his tutors. I remember the pride, sharp and fierce, watching him graduate from high school. He was the first in our family, but I also remember the quiet, worried conversations with Eleanor late at night. "Are we doing the right thing, Arturo?" she would ask, her voice soft in the darkness. "We're giving him everything we never had. Will he understand the value of it, or will he just learn to expect it?" Her words were a prophecy I was too proud and too tired to hear. I just wanted my son to have a life without the struggle that had defined mine. I thought that was the purest form of love. I tried to connect with him in my own way. For his 7th birthday, I spent a month carving a small horse from a solid block of mesquite wood. I sanded it until it was smooth as glass, painting on a saddle and bridle. I remembered the joy on his face when he saw it. He played with it for a week. Then, a friend from his private school showed him a new plastic toy from a big store in the city, and my wooden horse was forgotten in a corner of his room. It was a small thing, a childish thing, but it was the first time I felt a crack in the bridge I was building. He was already walking to a world I didn't belong in, a world where things that were handmade had less value than things that were bought. Then the light of my life, my Eleanor, got sick. It was a slow, cruel illness that stole her strength, but never her spirit. The helplessness was the worst part. All my strength, all my hard work couldn't fix this. I couldn't build a wall against death. The night before she passed, she held my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Arturo," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "Our son, he is a good man, but he is soft. You must always protect what we built. Not just for him, but for us. Protect the fruits of our labor. Promise me." I promised. It was a vow made over a lifetime of shared struggle, a promise to protect our legacy, the one built with sweat and secret dreams. After she was gone, the house became a hollow space filled with echoes. The silence was a physical weight. Marco was at the university in Monterrey, living his own life. The phone calls, which had been weekly, became monthly, then less. "I'm busy, Dad. Exams. A new project." I understood. I was proud of his ambition. But a cold loneliness began to creep into my bones. I was the old foundation of a house he was no longer living in. I told myself this was the natural order of things, that children grow up and build their own lives. But in the deepest, quietest part of my heart, I felt the chill of being left behind, a tool that had served its purpose and was now being put away. The first time Marco brought Susanna home, I knew things were going to change forever. She was beautiful, polished, and carried a purse that probably cost more than I made in a month. She smiled, but her eyes were quick, cataloging the simple furniture, the old photographs on the wall, the crack in the plaster I had never gotten around to fixing. She saw a past to be escaped, not a foundation to be honored, and the way Marco looked at her, it was with a desperate hunger for her approval. He laughed a little too loudly at her jokes, agreed with everything she said. He was a stranger to me in that moment, a man trying to shed the skin of his own past. Their wedding was a grand affair, something straight out of a magazine. Susanna's parents were wealthy, and she wanted a wedding that reflected her status, not Marco's origins. To give them the start she wanted, I did the unthinkable. I sold the small piece of land Eleanor and I had kept for ourselves, the one with the big pearl tree where we used to dream about our old age. It was our little piece of heaven. I sold it to pay for the caterers, the flowers, the fancy hall. It felt like I was selling a memory, a piece of Eleanor herself. When I gave Marco the money, he just gave me a quick hug. "Thanks, Dad, this will really help." He didn't ask what it had cost me. He didn't even notice a piece of me was gone. It seemed practical for me to move in with them after that. The house was a wedding gift from me, transferred from the holdings of EA Properties, though they never knew the details. They just thought I had been smart with money. At first, it was fine. I had the guest room. But then Susanna decided she wanted a home office. I was moved to a smaller room. A year later, that room became a nursery for their first child, and I was moved to the small, windowless room at the back of the house, the one that used to be for storage. My photographs of Eleanor, my old tools, my life, it was all packed into boxes and stacked in the garage. I was being systematically erased. My grandchildren, Sophia and Matteo, are not to blame. They are good children. But they have been taught that I am a piece of antique furniture. "Be quiet, Grandpa is resting." "Don't bother Abuelo with your noise," Susanna would correct them if they tried to ask me about the old days. "Don't listen to his stories, mi amor. He gets confused." They learned to love me from a distance, with a polite kiss on the cheek before they ran off to their video games. I would sit in my chair and watch them, a silent ghost in a house, built on the bedrock of my own sacrifices. They were being taught to be ashamed of the very history that gave them their comfortable lives. I sit in this room and remember Marco's 5th birthday. We had almost no money. Eleanor baked a simple cake, and we sang Las Mañanitas in our tiny kitchen. Marco's face, lit by 5 candles, was the picture of pure joy. We were a family. For my 82nd birthday last month, they were too busy to celebrate. Susanna's parents were in town. They ordered a pizza for me and left it on the kitchen counter with a note. Later that evening, Marco handed me a small, wrapped box. It was a pair of brown socks. The indifference was a blade that twisted in an old wound. It wasn't about the gift. It was about the complete and utter absence of thought, of love, of recognition. Now, back in my room, the muffled sound of their party finally fading, I look at my hands. They are wrinkled and covered in age spots, the knuckles swollen with arthritis. But beneath the skin, the strength is still there. These are the hands that signed the deeds. These are the hands that built the world Marco is so proud to live in, and so ashamed to have come from. He told me my stories are an embarrassment. He has no idea. He thinks my memories are worthless dust. He is about to learn that my memories are the very ground beneath his feet, and that a foundation, when it is disrespected, can be reclaimed. An old stonemason knows better than anyone that what a man builds he can also tear down. The change didn't happen overnight. It wasn't like a door slamming shut. It was more like a slow, creeping rust that eats away at metal until it's too weak to hold any weight. After Marco and Susanna married, the house I had given them began to feel less like my home. It started with little things. Susanna would rearrange the furniture in the living room, and my old armchair, the one Eleanor had picked out with me, would be moved to a less prominent spot. The photographs of my wife, of my parents, of my life before them, were slowly taken down from the walls. "Just to modernize the space a little, Arturo," she would say, her smile bright and empty. "We want it to feel like our home." I never said a word. I just watched my history get packed away into boxes. The first real step in my erasure was when they decided Susanna needed a home office. The guest room, where I had been staying, was the perfect spot, they said. So I was moved into the smaller bedroom down the hall. It was presented not as a demotion, but as a thoughtful gesture. "You'll be more comfortable here, Dad. It's cozier," Marco explained, avoiding my eyes. "And it's quieter on this side of the house." Cozier meant half the size, with a window that faced a brick wall. Quieter meant I was further away from the living room, from the kitchen, from the sounds of the family. I was being gently, politely, moved to the margins of my own life. I unpacked my few belongings in silence, the message as clear as if it had been written on the wall. Then came the birth of my first grandchild, Sophia. It should have been a moment of pure joy, and it was, but it also marked my final retreat. The cozy room was now destined to be the nursery. There was no discussion. It was simply announced. My new home was to be the small, windowless room at the back of the house, the one that had always been used for storage and smelled faintly of mothballs. Marco and Susanna helped me move my things. They stacked my boxes of memories, my old tools, my wedding album, my letters from Eleanor, in a corner of the garage, next to the lawnmower and old tires. I was now living in the space reserved for things that were no longer useful but weren't yet ready to be thrown away. The visits from Susanna's parents became a regular humiliation. They were wealthy, important people from Mexico City, and when they arrived, the entire house transformed into a stage for their comfort. I was expected to make myself scarce. "Arturo, my parents are a little formal. It's probably best if you just rest in your room so you're not overwhelmed," Susanna would tell me, her tone suggesting she was doing me a favor. One evening I stepped into the kitchen for a glass of water while they were all having cocktails. The laughter and conversation stopped instantly. Susanna's mother looked at me, her painted eyebrows raised, as if she had just seen a mouse scurry across her path. I felt like an intruder in the house my own sweat had paid for. Family dinners, once the bedrock of our week, began to crumble. In the early days of their marriage, we still ate together on Sundays. But the conversations shifted. They were about their friends from the country club, about stock portfolios, about their upcoming trip to Europe. My world of stone, soil, and memory had no currency at their table. Soon the Sunday dinners became dinner parties with their own friends. I would be given a plate early, alone in the kitchen. "So you don't have to deal with all the noise, Dad." The empty chair at the head of the table, my chair, was the first thing to disappear. Then, eventually, so did I. I was a ghost, lingering in the hallways, listening to the clinking of glasses from a life I was no longer part of. My grandchildren, Sophia and Matteo, were taught to see me as a fragile artifact. In their early years, they were full of the natural curiosity of children. They would climb onto my lap, their small hands tracing the wrinkles on my face, and ask for stories about the olden days. But Susanna was a constant, vigilant presence. "Don't bother Abuelo, mi amor. He needs to rest," she would coo, gently pulling them away. Or she would say, with a laugh that was sharp as glass, "Listen to Grandpa's tall tales, but don't believe everything. He gets his memories mixed up." They learned their lesson well. They learned that my past was fiction, that my mind was unreliable, and that my presence was a demand on their time. They learned to love me with a polite, distant kiss on the cheek. I remember one afternoon so clearly it still burns. I was in the small backyard with Matteo, who was about 6. I was showing him how to find the flattest stones to skip across the little decorative pond Susanna had installed. His face was alive with delight every time a stone jumped across the water. Then, Susanna came out of the house, a frown on her perfectly made-up face. "Matteo, come inside right now. You'll get dirt on your new pants. And please, leave your abuelo alone. He needs his peace and quiet." She took his hand and led him away. He looked back at me over his shoulder, his eyes wide with confusion. He never asked me to play with him again. She had taught him that I was not a source of joy, but an obligation to be managed. My birthdays became markers of my growing irrelevance. For my 79th birthday, they were away on a weekend trip to a vineyard with friends. I received a phone call filled with rushed apologies and promises to celebrate properly when they got back. They never did. For my 80th, a milestone, they had a dinner party for one of Marco's clients. They ordered me a pizza and left it on the kitchen counter. Later, Marco came to my room and handed me a gift bag. Inside was a pair of cheap slippers. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't the lack of an expensive gift, it was the utter lack of thought, the glaring proof that I was nothing more than an item on a long to-do list, easily forgotten. They lived in the house I had provided, a home built on a foundation of my life's work, but my contribution was a forgotten fact. When they spoke of their success, it was always in terms of our hard work, our smart investments. They spoke as if their comfortable life had materialized out of thin air, a product of their own brilliance. I never corrected them. What would have been the point? They had built their identity on the myth of being self-made, and my reality, my history of sacrifice, was an inconvenient truth. Admitting my role would have meant admitting they owed a debt, and it was clear they had no intention of ever acknowledging it, let alone repaying it. The most painful part of this long, slow winter was watching my son, my Marco, wither away. He began to adopt Susanna's views, her mannerisms, her quiet condescension. He started to look at my worn work clothes with embarrassment. "Dad, maybe you could wear the new shirt we got you when we have people over," he'd suggest, his voice strained. He was trying to sand down the rough edges of his own past, the very edges that I had carved. He was ashamed of the dirt under my fingernails because it reminded him of the dirt he came from. He was not just erasing me, he was erasing the boy I had raised. The boy who once looked at my calloused hands with admiration, not with shame. There was a moment, a small one, that showed me how far he had gone. The wooden railing on the front porch had come loose. I saw him outside one Saturday, struggling with a hammer and nails, making a mess of it. My old instincts kicked in. I went out, my hands ready to work. "Here, son, let me show you the trick to it," I said, reaching for the hammer. "You have to brace it from underneath first." He flinched, pulling the hammer away as if I had tried to steal it. "I've got it, Dad," he said, his jaw tight with irritation. "It's fine. If I can't fix it, I'll just call a handyman." A handyman. He would rather pay a stranger than accept the knowledge I had spent a lifetime acquiring. It was a rejection of my skills, my history, my very essence as a man. In the end, the most powerful weapon they used against me was silence. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic confrontations. It was much crueler than that. It was the simple, soul-crushing experience of being rendered invisible. I would sit in my old armchair, the one they hadn't yet moved to the garage, and they would move around me, their conversations flowing over and past me, as if I were a piece of furniture. They would discuss plans for the weekend, for their vacation, for their children's futures, right in front of me, without once including me or asking for my opinion. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of the message that I no longer mattered. Even the memory of Eleanor became a target. In one of her redecorating phases, Susanna decided the whole house needed a minimalist modern look. The only photograph I had left of my wife was a small, framed picture on my bedside table. One afternoon, while helping me clean my room, Susanna picked it up. "You know, Arturo, this frame is so old. We should put this picture in a nice album to keep it safe," she suggested. "It just doesn't really go with the new aesthetic." She wasn't trying to protect the photo. She was trying to bury it. She wanted to scrub the house clean of any history that predated her arrival. I held the frame tightly and just said, "No, it stays here." The coldness in her eyes told me I had failed some kind of test. The campaign to label me as mentally unfit was subtle but persistent. It began with suggestions that I should see a doctor about my forgetfulness. "Dad, you told us that story last week," Marco would say with a patient sigh, even if I hadn't. Susanna would chime in, "We're just worried about you, Arturo. It's normal at your age to get a little confused." They were not worried. They were building a narrative. If I was officially confused, then my stories were delusions. My presence was a medical issue. Their neglect wasn't neglect at all. It was the responsible management of an elderly parent with dementia. It was a cold, calculated strategy to absolve themselves of their guilt. The Christmas dinner last year was, perhaps, the most perfect illustration of my invisibility. Susanna's entire family was there. Her parents, her sister, her brother-in-law, their children. The dining table was set beautifully, with fine china and polished silverware. As everyone began to take their seats, I realized with a cold knot in my stomach that there was no place setting for me. They hadn't maliciously excluded me. They had simply forgotten I existed. Marco, his face flushing with embarrassment when he finally noticed, quickly squeezed an extra chair onto a corner of the table. I sat there, a postscript to the family gathering, the silence around me a stark contrast to the festive chatter that filled the room. The humiliation in front of Senor Ramirez was not an isolated incident. It was the public performance of a script they had been rehearsing in private for years. Many times I had tried to share a memory, a piece of the history of the very ground they walked on, only to be gently but firmly silenced. "Oh, Dad's off on one of his tangents again," Marco would say with a roll of his eyes to Susanna, a shared look of condescending affection passing between them. They had practiced dismissing me. They had perfected the art of treating my life's experiences as the rambling of a harmless but irrelevant old man. They had trained everyone around them, including their own children, to see me that way. The accumulation of these thousands of small cuts, these daily dismissals, had led me to a slow, heartbreaking conclusion. It wasn't about one dinner party or one forgotten birthday. It was a systematic dismantling of my role, my identity, my worth. I was no longer Arturo, the father, the builder, the patriarch. I had become a burden. I was an inconvenient, dusty relic of a past they were desperate to escape. I was a story they no longer wanted to hear, a foundation they had built upon and now wished to bury, pretending the whole grand structure was floating on air, a creation of their own making. And so, sitting in that dark storage closet room after the dinner party, the full weight of my promise to Eleanor finally crashed down upon me. For years I had thought my vow to protect the fruits of our labor meant safeguarding our wealth for Marco's future, ensuring he would always be secure. But in that moment of profound clarity, born of a decade of quiet humiliation, I understood her true meaning. I was not meant to protect our legacy per Toddy, him. I was meant to protect it from him. From his weakness, his ingratitude, his suffocating shame. My secret fortune, the one I had built with my own two hands, was not his inheritance. It was my armor. It was the last tool I had left to reclaim the dignity they had so carelessly stripped away. My son, in his quest for a future he felt I couldn't be a part of, had forgotten the most basic lesson I ever tried to teach him. You must always respect the foundation. He saw an old man in a worn-out chair, a mind clouded with dusty memories. He never once thought to ask what those memories were made of. He was so busy looking up at the life he wanted to build, he never bothered to look down at the ground he was standing on. He had no idea that I owned it, all of it. The very ground he dismissed as my past was, in fact, his entire present, and I was about to reclaim the deed. My promise to Eleanor was not to protect our legacy for him, but to protect it from him. It all started so long ago, with my compadre Beto. We were just two young men with calloused hands and more ambition than pesos. While other men spent their extra money on cantina nights or new boots, we bought land. Not the good land, not the plots in the city. We bought the forgotten land, the dusty mesas and rocky hillsides that everyone laughed at. "What are you going to do with that, Arturo? Farm scorpions?" They'd joke. But Beto and I, we saw the new roads being surveyed. We saw the city breathing, expanding. We knew that one day, the city would need our dust. We formed a simple company, a partnership on a handshake, that we later made official with a lawyer. We called it EA Properties. Eleanor and Arturo. It was our secret, our quiet bet on tomorrow. We kept it a secret from Marco for a simple reason, a reason that now feels like a bitter prophecy. Eleanor and I, we saw what unearned money did to people. We saw the sons of wealthy ranchers in our village become soft, useless men who valued nothing because they had never worked for anything. "Wealth is a test, Arturo," my Eleanor used to say, her voice full of a wisdom I was only just beginning to understand. "It doesn't build character, it reveals it. Our son must build his own character first. He must learn the weight of a peso earned with his own sweat." We wanted him to stand on his own 2 feet, not knowing that we had already laid a bedrock of gold beneath them. Eleanor was the soul of our secret. She had the foresight. I had the knowledge of the land, but she had the knowledge of the human heart. She was the one who insisted we set up the company properly, with a good lawyer, Senor Benitez, a man who has been my confidant for 40 years. She would pack a lunch, and we would walk out to our worthless plots on Sundays, sitting under a mesquite tree, dreaming. "This is for our old age, mi amor," she would say. "And it's a safety net for Marco, but only if he proves he doesn't need one." Her words now echo in the silence of my room, a painful reminder of a lesson my son failed to learn. He never understood the value of what he had, because he was never allowed to feel its absence. My compadre Beto passed on more than 20 years ago. He was a man of his word, solid as the cantera stone we used to haul together. We never had a written contract between us, just a bond of sweat and trust. Before he died, he signed his half of EA Properties over to me completely. "You were always the visionary, Arturo," he told me, his hand frail but his grip firm. "You'll know what to do with it. Just promise me you'll use it to build something that lasts." I thought he meant buildings. I now realize he meant dignity. He left me as the sole silent owner of a forgotten kingdom that was slowly waking up around us. The scale of it is hard to explain, even to myself. That barren hill where they built the modern Tech Milenio campus, that was ours. The sprawling industrial park on the road to Saltillo, where Marco's company has its shiny glass offices, we bought that land for what a new truck costs today. The entire residential community where he and Susanna live, with its manicured lawns and country club, it was once a dusty patch of scrubland we bought from a desperate farmer during a drought. We paid pennies for acres that are now worth millions. I was a stonemason, you see. I didn't just know how to build walls. I knew the earth they were built on. I knew its secrets, its value, its potential, long before the men in suits ever drew their maps. My lawyer, the son of the original Senor Benitez, tries to explain the numbers to me. He unrolls charts and shows me documents. He says the total value of the properties, the leases, the land itself, is over $50 million. 50 million. The number is meaningless to me. It's like trying to count the grains of sand in a wheelbarrow. I am still the same man who knows the satisfaction of a perfectly laid brick, the man who shared a taco with the love of his life, because it was all we had. The money was never the point. The land was the point. It was our work, our vision, our legacy. It was the fruit of our labor that my wife made me promise to protect. They saw an old man. They saw a burden. They saw a collection of embarrassing stories and a mind that was fading. Their condescension was a thick blanket they wrapped around me, hoping to smother the man I used to be. They never once imagined that the quiet, forgetful old man in the corner was the architect of their entire world. My silence wasn't confusion. It was observation. I watched them. I listened to their plans, their talk of smart investments and our hard work, all while living in my house, on my land. And they were too blinded by their own self-importance to see the quiet truth sitting right in front of them. My wisdom was not in books or degrees. It was in patience. The house they live in is the most painful irony of all. Marco believes it was a wedding gift, a generous gesture from a father who had been smart with his money. He doesn't know the truth. The house is, and has always been, owned by EA Properties. What he signed, what he thought was a deed transfer, was actually a lifetime lease agreement. The rent was symbolic, 1 peso a year, but there was a clause, written by the wise old Senor Benitez decades ago, a morality clause. It stipulated that the lease was valid only as long as the primary benefactor, me, was treated with the dignity and respect befitting a patriarch. He signed it without reading it, too eager to accept the gift. He never knew his right to live there was conditional. And then there is his job, the place he goes every day, the source of his pride and his ambition, the very promotion he was groveling for at that humiliating dinner party. The entire office park, including the building that houses his company, sits on land owned by EA Properties. Every month, his boss, Senor Ramirez, authorizes a substantial lease payment to a holding company he has never met. My son works tirelessly to impress a man who is, for all intents and purposes, my tenant. He has spent years building his career on a foundation he is ashamed of, paying rent to a father he has rendered invisible. The sheer staggering blindness of it all is a tragedy of his own making. He has a university degree. He speaks of finance and market trends with an authority that silences rooms. I can barely read the newspaper without my glasses, but I understand things he never will. I understand that a man who doesn't know his own history is a man adrift. He built his life on a story of his own success, but it was a fiction. The real story was written in deeds and property records, filed away in a dusty office in Guadalajara. He learned how to make money, but he never learned how to measure worth. He saw my calloused hands as a symbol of the poverty he escaped, not as the instruments that built his gilded cage. My revenge will not be a shouting match. There will be no dramatic confrontation, no tearful accusations. That is their world, a world of flimsy emotions and loud displays. My world is the world of stone. My justice will be silent, methodical, and absolute. My tools are no longer a hammer and a trowel. They are a pen, a telephone, and the unwavering loyalty of a lawyer who has guarded my secret for decades. I will not raise my voice. I will simply sign my name. I will dismantle his world with the same quiet deliberation I used to build it. The stonemason knows that what has been built can be unbuilt, one stone at a time. I finally understand my promise to Eleanor. Protect the fruits of our labor. For so long I thought the fruit was the money, the land, the assets. I was wrong. The fruit was our dignity. It was the self-respect earned through a lifetime of honest work. It was the love that we built our family on. The money is just soil, and in the hands of my son it would only grow weeds of arrogance and ingratitude. To honor Eleanor, I cannot let him inherit a fortune he has proven he is unworthy of. I must protect the true fruit of our lives, our good name, and the honor of our struggle. For years I have been a ghost in their house, a passive observer of my own erasure. I followed their rules, accepted their condescending pats on the hand, and faded into the background as commanded. But they made a fatal mistake. They forgot who I am. I am not just a resident in this house. I am its architect. I am the one who drew the plans, who chose the stone, who laid the foundation. And an architect always retains the power to look at his creation and decide that a structural change is necessary to preserve its integrity. The plan is not born of anger. Anger is a hot, quick fire that burns out. This is something colder, heavier. This is justice. It is the restoration of balance. It is the simple, undeniable weight of truth. When a wall is not plumb, when its foundation is compromised, you don't argue with it. You don't try to reason with it. You take it down and build it again, the right way. My son and his wife have proven to be a faulty structure, built on a foundation of shame and disrespect. It is my duty, as the master builder, to correct the error. Marco called my memories an embarrassment. He will soon learn that those memories are notarized, legally binding documents stored in a fireproof vault. He dismissed my stories as the worthless ramblings of a confused old man. He is about to discover that one of those stories holds the title to his house, the lease to his workplace, and the key to the future he was so certain I had no place in. He wanted me to be silent. He will get his wish. But my silence will be the sound of his world coming down around him. A new story is about to begin, and in this one, the old man finally gets to speak. The next morning, I did not come out of my room. I listened to them leave for work and school, the familiar sounds of a life that no longer included me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with purpose. I sat on the edge of my bed, the old phone feeling heavy in my hand, and I dialed the number I knew by heart. Benitez, a crisp voice answered. It was the son, a man who had known me his entire life. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. It is Arturo, I said, my voice steady. It is time to make some changes to the properties. Let's start with the industrial park on the Saltillo Road. I want you to terminate the commercial lease for the entire lot. The reason? Owner's intent to redevelop. Give them 90 days' notice, effective immediately. There was a brief silence on the other end, then a simple, "As you wish, Don Arturo." I hung up. The first stone was laid. There was no anger, no satisfaction. Just a quiet, solid feeling of a foundation being reset. My next instruction for Senor Benitez concerned the house, this house. The one where my history was packed away in the garage, and my dignity was an inconvenience. An eviction felt too much like their kind of cruelty, a loud, ugly scene. My justice had to be silent, like the turning of a page. The house on Calle de los Fresnos, I told Benitez. I want you to transfer the title from EA Properties directly into my name. Once that is done, you will draft a new rental agreement. Send it to Marco and Susana, full market value. Give them 30 days to sign, or 30 days to vacate. I knew they couldn't afford it. They had built their lives on the assumption of a free foundation. I wasn't kicking them out. I was simply handing them the bill for the life they had so proudly claimed as their own creation. The price of their independence was finally being calculated, and I knew they would find their pockets empty. But the land, the money, that was never the true inheritance. My Eleanor knew that. The real fruit of our labor was the value of hard work, the honor in a life of sweat and honesty. That legacy could not be left to a son who was ashamed of it. And finally, Benitez, I said, my voice softer now, I want to create a foundation. We will call it the Eleanor Foundation. Its purpose will be to give scholarships to young men and women who want to learn a trade. Masonry, carpentry, welding, the skills that build a country. The entire fortune of EA Properties, every last centavo, would go to this foundation. My will would be simple. Marco would be left $1. A single American dollar, because he and Susana seemed to admire all things from the North so much. It was not a punishment. It was a statement. His inheritance had already been spent on a life he never appreciated. With the single dollar, I would leave a letter. Not a letter of anger or sadness, a ledger. It would be a simple accounting of his true inheritance. It would state, plainly, that his education was his inheritance. The wedding I paid for was his inheritance. The years of living in a house without paying a single peso of rent was his inheritance. Every meal I provided, every sacrifice Eleanor and I made so his hands could remain soft, that was his inheritance. He had received a king's ransom over the course of his life, but he was too busy looking for a crown to notice. The letter would be the final story I told him, the one he could not interrupt, the one that would prove my memories were not an embarrassment, but the very currency of his existence. It would be the truth, written in black and white, undeniable and final. After the phone call, a profound peace settled over me. I packed a small bag with a few changes of clothes, the old photograph of Eleanor, and my father's stonemason hammer. I did not wait for the notices to be delivered. I did not need to see the fallout. My work was done. I walked out of that house for the last time, not as a ghost retreating to his room, but as the architect leaving his finished project. I took a bus to Guadalajara, to a small, clean apartment Senor Benitez had arranged for me, a place where the window looks out over a small plaza. I have my dignity back. It isn't in the money or the land. It's in this silence, this peace. It is the solid, unshakable knowledge that I honored my wife. I protected the fruits of our labor, and I finally built something for myself. A quiet end to a long life, on a foundation of my own making.